The county assessor's form listed the old mill under two words that said everything about how the county saw it. No value, not low, not disputed. A flat zero next to a building her brother Roy had spent 22 years of his life inside, and $4,100 for the 80 acres of eastern Kentucky hillside around it. Timber ground too steep to log easily, a creek too shallow to fish well, and a mill wheel that hadn't ground a grain of corn since before Mona Farrell was born. That was everything Mona inherited when Roy died in March, 6 weeks after the diagnosis, 4 weeks faster than the doctors had said. She was 47 years old. She had $812 in her checking account, a 2006 Subaru with 167,000 miles on it, and a heater that worked on its own schedule. She had those things because 14 months earlier, the day after her husband Neil's funeral, Neil, who died of a heart attack at 51, she had opened the bank statements he'd kept in a locked drawer and discovered $46,000 in debt from a gambling habit she hadn't known existed. The house was gone before the headstone was set. She'd been living in a spare bedroom at her colleague Sandra's apartment in Lexington since October. She owned 2 suitcases and a box of her mother's dishes and a framed photograph of Roy and her, taken somewhere in the mountains when she was maybe 12 and Roy was 17, and the world was still a place where things made sense. That's where we're starting today, and if you've ever stood in a county office and watched the last thing a person owned reduced to a number on a form, stay with us. This one goes somewhere you won't expect. Roy's attorney, a careful man named Pemberton, had delivered the news over the phone in the particular tone people use when they're handing over bad news they've had time to rehearse. Back taxes of $800 and change were owed. The structure had 0 assessed value. There had been inquiries from a timber company. She'd want to move quickly if she planned to sell. She planned to sell. She planned to drive out, assess, call the timber company, take whatever they offered, and be back in Lexington by Sunday. She hadn't been to the mill since she was 19. The drive took 5 hours and changed its nature 3 times along the way. The interstate thinned to a state highway, which thinned to a county road, which thinned to a gravel track along a creek that a person wouldn't trust in rain, single lane, hemmed by red maples and river birch, climbing into the Harlan County hills by a route that felt less like a road and more like a memory. She rolled the window down an inch somewhere past the last cell signal and let the mountain in. It smelled like wet shale and creek water and something woodsy and resinous underneath, the kind of smell that lives in high cold places and doesn't travel. Her whole body knew it before her mind did. Roy had brought her here summers as a child. He was the one who taught her which clouds meant weather and which meant nothing, how to follow a creek line without losing it, how to tell the difference between a timber rattler's track and a water snake's in creek mud. She'd been 8 years old, and she'd thought he was talking about the woods. Now she was starting to understand. He might have been talking about something else entirely. The clearing opened at the end of the gravel, and there it was. The mill was older than either of them and looked it, log walls dark with decades of weather, a tin roof gone the color of an old spoon, a stone chimney that leaned maybe 5 degrees off true. The wheel on the north wall was 12 feet across and made of iron and old oak, and it was turning, slowly, steadily, driven by the creek current, the paddles dipping and rising in a rhythm that sounded like breathing. Mona sat in the car with the engine off and listened to it turn. She hadn't expected it to be turning. She came here to sell a place she barely remembered. She hadn't expected the place to still be running. Inside smelled like sawdust and burnt coffee and cedar shavings and the low particular smell of a fire that had been out less than a day. 2 enamel mugs on the shelf above the sink, 2 chairs at the table, a second blanket folded at the foot of the cot in the back room, too neat for accident. The stove was cold, but the ash in the firebox was recent. She was standing at the window reading the spines of Roy's paperbacks when she heard boots on the gravel outside and went very still. The boy who appeared in the doorway was maybe 16 or 17, tall in the way of someone still assembling himself, wearing a canvas jacket 2 sizes large that hadn't started out his. He had a splitting axe at his side and he stopped dead when he saw her. They looked at each other across the room. "I keep the wood," he said, "the way a person states a credential, quick and clear so there's no misunderstanding. And I run the wheel gate mornings. Keep the creek clear so the wheel don't bind." Mona looked at the axe. "Who told you to do that?" Roy did. Roy died 6 weeks ago. Yes, ma'am, the boy said. He told me before. His name was Kaysen, 17 years old. He'd been sleeping in Roy's woodshed since the previous September, and before that in a tent in the state forest through most of the summer, and before that in a series of places he didn't name and Mona didn't push on. His father had worked the mine until the seam played out, and the company shut the gates, and after that his father had worked at other things, and after that at nothing, and eventually at nothing at all. That was all Kaysen said about it, and Mona understood it was all he was offering. She made coffee and carried 2 cups out to the porch, and they sat on the steps looking at the same wall of trees without talking, which it turned out was the only way Kaysen Briley knew how to be close to another person, at a careful angle, with the tree line always in sight. If you're still with us, go ahead and subscribe before we go any further, because what Mona found inside that mill is going to change everything you think this story is about. She didn't drive back to Lexington that night. The gravel track was no road for dark, she told herself, and that was true. The truer thing was the sound of the wheel in the creek. It was the most consistent thing she'd heard in over a year. She wasn't ready to leave it. She built a fire in the stove the way Roy had taught them both as children. Kindling teepeed tight, draft lever cracked just so, and she made coffee on the propane burner, and sat at the table in the lamplight, and for the first time since she'd opened Neil's drawer, no one in the world knew exactly where she was. That should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like setting something down that she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten it had a weight. She slept in the back room on Roy's cot under a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and sleep, and she slept hard the way you sleep at altitude, and she woke before light to the sound of the wheel still turning in the dark outside. The same sound. Patient. Continuous. A thing that could have stopped long ago and hadn't. Kaysen came at dawn and disappeared at dusk for the first few days, appearing at the woodline and pulling back into it, the way a dog that has been kicked will come near a fire but not within reach. She didn't press. She left a cup of coffee on the porch rail and didn't watch to see if he took it. He took it. By the 4th morning, he was rehanging the woodshed door, which had been leaning off its upper hinge since winter, and she handed him tools when he needed them, and asked nothing beyond that, and by noon the door swung clean. They ate soup at the table that evening, the first time he came inside without standing near the door, and somewhere in the second bowl he started talking about Roy. He'd be on the wheel gate by first light, Kaysen said, watching the steam come off his spoon, just listening to it turn. I asked him once what he was listening for. What did he say? The boy turned the spoon over. Said he was listening for the sound of something that could have quit a long time ago but didn't. He looked up at her. I thought he was talking about the wheel. Mona didn't answer. She was beginning to understand that with Roy the thing he said was almost never only the thing he said. He let me stay, Kaysen said, a long beat later. First night I knocked, he just opened the door. Didn't ask me where I'd been or where I was going. Set a bowl of food on the table and pointed at the woodshed and said the cot was made up. He set his spoon down. I waited 4 days before I believed it wasn't going to cost me something. What changed your mind? He was quiet a moment. He never once made me feel like I owed him. Mona refilled his coffee and sat back down, and they finished the meal in a quiet that had nothing guarded in it, which was the rarest thing she'd felt in years. On the 9th day, clearing wood out of the lean-to stacked against the north wall, she found the loose plank. It wasn't age that had worked it free. She'd been around enough old structures by then to know the difference. The seam at its edge was too straight, too intentional. She'd have missed it under the wood stack, but she'd moved the last of the splits, and the lantern light caught the cut clean. She worked the blade of her pocket knife into the gap, and the board came up with a dry, woody sound, like a breath held a very long time finally released. Beneath it was a cavity between the floor joists, sealed against the damp with a folded sheet of plastic. Inside the plastic, a metal strongbox, olive green, the kind sold at any hardware store, a flat bundle of envelopes bound with a rubber band gone brittle, and a flip phone, small, old, scratched across the back, with a strip of electrical tape on it that read in Roy's handwriting, Mona, only. She lifted the box out. It wasn't locked. Inside were 3 things: a green cloth ledger, soft-cornered, the binding cracked from years of use, a red pocket knife with a blade worn thin from sharpening, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a list of 43 names with dates going back to 2001. She opened the ledger and read the first entry standing on the floor. October 14, 2001. A miner named Burford Eck came to the door after midnight, walked off the mountain after the number 11 seam flooded, and took 3 men he'd worked beside for 6 years. His wife left in August. He didn't plan to come this far. He didn't know who sent him, fed him. He talked until the fire burned low. In the morning I drove him to his sister's in Pineville. Left the wheel running so he could hear it from the road going down. She read it twice, then she turned the page. Stay with us here, because what was written in those pages is the thing that turns this mill into something Harlan County will never be able to forget. Subscribe now, because what Mona found in that ledger took Roy Farrell's whole life and held it up to the light. He had done it for 22 years. Not announced, not recorded anywhere the county or the church or the newspaper would ever see. He had kept the door unlocked and the wheel running and the fire banked, and he had fed people on the worst nights of their lives, and listened without pressing, and in the morning loaded them into his cracked frame truck, and driven them to wherever they needed to go next. The ledger went page after page, miners with black lung and nowhere to put the rage of it, men who'd walked out of the Harlan County Detention Center with a bus token and a garbage bag, and a list of phone numbers that rang to nothing. A woman named Yvette who had sat at his table for 4 hours without speaking, and then said one thing, and then slept for 14 hours in the back room, and left before dawn with $60 Roy had pressed into her coat pocket. A boy of 19 who showed up in a January ice storm with no coat on and stayed 3 days without saying much, and left when he was ready. Left the red knife on the table when he went, Roy had written. Said it had gotten him through the worst of it, and now maybe it could do the same for somebody else. I keep it where I can find it. Mona looked at the red knife in the box. She understood now what it was. She understood the 2 mugs on the shelf, the second blanket. The axe hung at a height that suited a boy and not a man. She understood why Roy had never left Harlan County and never explained why to anyone who asked. She read the entries aloud after a while, to the empty room, because it felt wrong to let words that quiet pass through the air without sound. Kaysen came in from the woodshed and stood in the doorway and listened without taking off his coat. When she reached an entry dated September of last year, one with no name, only the words came out of the state forest, wouldn't say much, set him up in the woodshed. The boy turned and went back out to the porch. Mona let him go. She knew what he'd just read, and she understood that some things a person needs to receive alone. The white truck came up the gravel on a Wednesday, new clean, a company placard in the window, Crossridge Timber, LLC. The man who got out was 60 or so, trim in a quilted vest and boots that had never once seen mud, with the patient ease of someone who is accustomed to waiting because he already knows how things end. His name was Trask. He said Crossridge had been in discussion with Roy's estate about the timber rights. He said the old growth on the upper slope was exceptional, the market was strong, and he had a number in mind that he believed would be of real interest to someone in her position. Her position. That was Neil's phrase. Not the same words but the same architecture, the gentle downward pressure of it, the implication that her circumstances were something to be managed out of, rather than lived through. She told him the land wasn't for sale. He named a number. She said it again. He named a higher one. She said it a third time and left it there. The ease drained out of his face like heat out of a cold room. He told her then, in the mild informational tone of someone who keeps his threats and his pleasantries in the same key, that the structure had been informally flagged by the county for building deficiencies 2 years prior. That a formal complaint could complicate her ability to occupy or sell. That a right-of-way question regarding the county road was something his surveyors had noted and might need to examine. He set his card on the porch railing, since she hadn't taken it from his hand. People in your situation tend to find the arithmetic makes itself clear with a little time, he said. I'll check back. He got in the white truck and went down the gravel, and Mona stood on the porch a long while after the sound of him faded. She held the card in both hands and didn't go back inside. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay on Roy's cot listening to the wheel turn in the dark, and thought about the 43 names in the ledger, and the ones who'd had far less than her, and faced far worse, and had still found their way to this clearing, because a light was on, and the door wasn't locked. She thought about Kaysen, asleep in the woodshed, who had learned to keep the wheel running before anyone had to ask him. In the morning she drove into Loyal. The woman at the gas station directed her to the woman at the diner, who directed her 2 blocks off Main to a yellow house with a garden that said its owner wasn't the sitting-still type. Her name was Lois Creech. She'd spent 31 years as the Harlan County property clerk before she retired. She answered the door in work gloves, looked at Mona for 3 full seconds and said, "You're Roy's sister." "How'd you know?" Lois pulled off a glove. "You've got his way of standing, come in. I'll make coffee and you can tell me what Crossridge did." She laid it out at the kitchen table. Lois listened the way a person listens, when nothing they're hearing surprises them. "None of it's real," Lois said when Mona finished. "No formal citation has been filed on that property in 11 years. The right-of-way on that road is recorded in the deed books going back to 1944 and it runs with the land. Building complaint is a bluff. Right-of-way question is a bluff." She poured the coffee and sat down. "Crossridge knows this. What I want to know is whether Roy ever did anything specific with the timber rights. Roy was a deliberate man. He didn't leave things unprotected by accident." Mona thought about the bundle of envelopes from the strongbox. She hadn't opened them. She'd been afraid to, somehow, the way you're afraid to read the last pages of something. She opened them at Lois Creech's kitchen table. The rubber band crumbled. She counted 11 envelopes. The first held a carbon copy of a recorded instrument, dated 9 years ago, filed in Deed Book 331, page 44. "Roy Farrell hereby transferred all timber and extraction rights to the 80-acre Farrell Creek parcel to the Eastern Kentucky Land Heritage Trust, in perpetuity, in exchange for $1 and the trust's agreement to maintain the property in its current use for no less than 50 years. In perpetuity. She read it twice and looked up at Lois, who was already smiling, not warm but solid. "He knew," Mona said slowly. "Trask knew about this." "A title search pulls this document in an afternoon," Lois said. "He's known about it longer than you have." "Then why offer at all? You can't log land you don't hold the timber rights to." Lois set her coffee down with the precision of a person placing a period. "Because rights can be amended, or a trust short on funding can be persuaded to release them for a better deal elsewhere. Small conservancies have made worse trades." She looked at Mona straight. "He wasn't trying to buy your land. He was trying to buy your ignorance. Once he held the deed, even a restricted deed, he'd have walked to that trust with a checkbook and made them an offer they couldn't say no to. Then he'd have gotten the restriction lifted quietly, and the timber would have been gone in a season. He was counting on me not knowing what I had." "He was counting on 2 things," Lois said. "That you were grieving enough and broke enough to take a quick exit." She tapped the transfer document. "Roy made sure that wouldn't be sufficient. He did it 9 years ago and never told a living soul." "He never told anyone anything," Mona said. And then she told Lois about the ledger. Lois went very still. She didn't look at the ledger. Mona had brought it from the car. She looked past it, at the kitchen window, at something a long way off. When she spoke, her voice had changed registers. "My nephew," she said, 2014. He was 31 and he'd been bad for 5 years, and we didn't know how bad until the night he called me from the number 11 boat ramp." She paused. "I don't know who pointed him to Roy. He never said. He only told me there was a man on the creek who kept a wheel turning, and that if you sat with him long enough you started to believe you could too." She looked at Mona. "My nephew's 41 now. Coaches youth wrestling in Everts. Hasn't had a drink in a decade." She put her hand flat on the ledger cover. "Is he in there?" Mona found the page. Lois read her nephew's entry herself, standing in silence. She didn't cry, but something moved in her face that took a moment to settle. "Roy never told me," she said. "He never told anyone," Mona said. "The county found out the way small counties always do, all at once, after a long, slow accumulation of knowing without saying. Lois told one person, and that person told 2, and by the Saturday after, there were trucks in the clearing that hadn't been there before. Burford Eck was there. Not the broken man from the 2001 ledger entry, but what that man had become over 23 years. A gray-haired union steward built like a fence post, who stood in the clearing with his hat in both hands and couldn't quite meet her eyes directly. He told her Roy had driven him to Pineville in the middle of the night without asking anything in return, and that he'd been trying to figure out how to settle that debt ever since. "Roy told me once, Burford said. That the only account that matters is the one where you give to the next man instead of paying back the last one. I've been doing that for 20 years. Just thought you should know. A woman brought a casserole covered in foil and set it on the porch railing and didn't say anything, because some debts don't fit in sentences. The man who ran the hardware store on Loyal's Main Street, a quiet fellow named Lonzo, brought 2 boxes of supplies unprompted and refused payment. Roy carried my family on credit for 3 months when the mine went to half shifts in '08, he said. Wouldn't let me square it when things came back. Said the debt wasn't mine to pay. Said to give it to the next person who needed it instead. He looked at the boxes. I've been giving it to the next person ever since. So you'll take these. Mona took them. She was learning that in Harlan County, refusing a kindness was its own kind of unkindness. That Roy had been, all his quiet life, the source that fed an entire river of small debts nobody collected and gifts nobody announced, and that river hadn't stopped moving just because the source was gone. Trask came back on a Friday. He didn't get out of the truck. Lois Creech walked down off the porch in her wool coat with a manila envelope and passed the recorded transfer document through his window. Mona watched from the mill door. She watched him read the first paragraph. She watched his neck go red. She watched him say something that didn't carry. And she watched Lois answer it with the particular serenity of a woman who'd spent 31 years in a county clerk's office and had met every variety of man who believed that paperwork could be intimidated. The window went up. The white truck reversed down the gravel track for the last time. Careful now, and Mona never saw it again. He came for the timber, Lois said, climbing the porch steps. Roy locked the gate 9 years ago. He just didn't bother to tell Crossridge that the key wasn't for sale. Mona wasn't going to sell. She'd known it for days, now she knew why. She found a micro USB charger in the kitchen drawer and charged the flip phone overnight. She listened to Roy's voice memo alone, sitting on the hearthstones with the fire low and the wheel turning outside in the dark. What was in it she never told anyone. Not Kaysen, not Lois, not the people who asked gently over the weeks that followed. She kept it close, the way you keep the one piece of evidence that tells you who you actually came from. She took 3 shifts a week at the Loyal IGA to cover the propane and the back taxes. She learned to run the wheelgate the way Kaysen had taught her. The particular angle of the lever that cleared the debris gate without flooding the race. She walked the creek on clear afternoons, first out of restlessness, and then out of something that felt, after a while, like belonging that had nothing to do with a deed. And she started a second ledger. She bought a green cloth notebook from the IGA and tucked Roy's list of 43 names inside the front cover, and she waited. She didn't wait long. It was a night in November, cold and starless, when headlights she didn't recognize came slowly up the gravel and stopped in the clearing. A man climbed out, 50-something, still in his work clothes, a contractor's patch on his sleeve. He stood in the clearing and looked at the mill and at the wheel turning in the dark, and at the one light Mona had burning in the window. The lamp she lit every night now, the way Roy had kept the wheel running, so the clearing would never look empty to someone who needed it not to be. He stood there for a long time before he walked to the porch. I saw the light, he said. His voice had the flat, careful quality of someone regulating it hard. I'm sorry to bother you, I can go. You can't go, Mona said. It's too cold and that's a long road back in the dark. She held the door open. Come in, there's a fire and there's food. The back room's made up. He didn't move for a moment. Why? Mona had heard that question before, in the ledger, in 43 different handwritings, on 43 different nights. She'd heard it in Kaysen's silence that first morning on the porch steps. She'd heard it in her own chest, somewhere around the 4th night in the mill, when she'd understood for the first time in a long time that she was not a burden. Someone was tolerating, but a person a place was glad to hold. My brother used to get asked that a lot, she said. Come inside. She fed him and didn't ask him questions he wasn't ready for. In the morning he sat at the table a long time before he said anything, and what he said was the kind of thing a person needs to say to someone who isn't going to flinch. She didn't flinch. When he left, mid-morning steadier, she opened the new ledger and wrote the date, and what little she knew, and at the end of the entry, the only line that mattered. The wheel keeps turning. The door isn't locked. Told him he could come back. Kaysen read it over her shoulder. He'd long since stopped keeping one eye on the tree line. He had, in the way of careful wild things given enough room and enough time, decided to trust the clearing he'd found himself in. He'd have kept it exactly the same, Kaysen said. He'd have kept you, Mona said. The boy went still the way he did when something landed that he didn't know how to carry yet. Then he nodded once and went out to check the wheel gate, because it needed checking and he was the one who did that. Mona watched him through the window, a thin kid in a jacket that finally fit him, moving through the morning mist toward the creek, toward the wheel that had kept turning because one person, and then two and then three had decided it should. Maybe that's the part most of us miss. We spend our lives measuring the wrong things. The house, the retirement account, the marriage, the career we built with someone who was keeping secrets in a locked drawer. We let the people who measure worth that way tell us what we're worth too, and then we lose the things we measured, and we're left standing in a county office watching a number printed on a form, and the number says 0. Roy Farrell had a mill that the county valued at nothing and 80 acres that weren't worth the cost of logging and a wheel that served no commercial purpose on earth. And he had made of those things the most load-bearing structure in Harlan County because he understood what it actually takes to hold a place together. He fed strangers in the dark for 22 years and wrote each one down not as a debt but as a life, and he never told a soul. Trask came up that gravel road with a checkbook and a folder of projections, and he lost to a man who'd been dead 6 weeks, because he never once understood that what Roy Farrell had built here couldn't be purchased. You can't buy what enough people have quietly come to depend on. You can only inherit it, and only if you're willing to stay. That was Roy's real inheritance. Not the 80 acres, not the mill the assessor wrote off at 0, not even the ledger, though the ledger was the closest thing to a sacred text Mona had ever held. He left her a wheel and a door, and the understanding that a person who keeps something running in the dark, not for themselves, but so that anyone walking off the worst night of their life will hear that something is still moving, is doing the most important work there is. So if there's a wheel you've been meaning to keep turning, some small and unannounced act of staying that you've been telling yourself doesn't matter because nobody sees it, keep it going anyway. Keep it going for all the nights no one comes, because you will almost never know which night was the one that mattered. And to the person who hears it on the road coming up in the dark, it will mean more than you could ever measure. Mona Farrell was 47 years old. She had $800 in a Subaru with 167,000 miles on it, and a piece of eastern Kentucky hillside the county valued at nothing. She had a ledger with 44 entries and counting. She had a door that wasn't locked and had never been. She had a boy in the woodshed who finally slept through the night, and a wheel in the creek that had been turning since before either of them arrived and would be turning long after. Every morning before anything else, she walked out to the wheel gate and checked the angle of the lever and listened to the paddles lift and fall in the current. The sound of something that could have stopped a long time ago and hadn't. And she understood that she was not at the end of anything. She was just getting started.